Sup, chooms, how y'all living? Hope everything is Nova and you all had a preem Valentine's Day with the missus, who is no doubt grateful to have something to rub her hands through whenever she touches your scalp. So, I gotta tell you homies, things are looking very exciting for the future of hair loss research. Of course, we already have two outstanding treatments available in the form of finasteride minoxidil, which will work for the overwhelming majority of people who use them, but no matter how good a treatment may be, there will always be a small segment of people who cannot use the drugs because of factors like side effects, or just due to being poor responders perhaps. Fortunately, for the first time in a good while, we've got some really exciting future treatments in the pipeline, including the WNT WNT pathway drugs like WAY 316606 and KY 19382, which work by targeting the downstream effects of DHT as opposed to directly targeting the androgen itself. And we also have some treatments coming up that target hair loss through more familiar mechanisms, such as piralutamide, which is a topical anti-androgen. With each passing day, it is becoming more and more evident that the time of DHT terrorizing our hair follicles is finally coming to an end, and that trash hormones tyranny will be brought to an end through the power of science, and not through new age woo and bullshit natural approaches like broccoli and scalp massages. As we speak, we have hair loss witchers across the entire globe using their collective talents to bring forth both new innovations towards defeating hair loss, as well as reinforcing and improving therapies through proven mechanisms already. Out of all these new innovations towards curing androgenic alopecia, perhaps one of the most interesting and downright promising ones I have come across involves the usage of RNA technology. The research behind this comes from the journal Nature, which is one of the most highly regarded scientific journals in the entire world. It definitely isn't anything like Medical Hypotheses, which is a journal that publishes AIDS denialism papers, as well as fake theories from fake researchers like Paul Taylor about skull expansion causing hair loss. On the contrary, Nature is absolutely top tier, so this research is definitely worth a look. So here's the article in question. It's titled, quote, "Weekly treatment with SAMiRNA targeting the androgen receptor ameliorates androgenic alopecia," unquote. This is an article from our friends in Good Korea, where a lot of hair loss research is done, even though Asians seem to have less androgenic alopecia than Westerners, which leads me to believe Good Korea's research into androgenic alopecia is grounded in altruism, so God bless them for that. Anyways, in the introduction to the article, the researchers talk about the well-established fact that androgenic alopecia is due to the trash hormone DHT destroying our hair follicles. We know DHT is primarily created by the enzyme 5-alpha reductase, also known as 5-AR, which converts testosterone into DHT, and that is why finasteride works, since it suppresses this 5-AR enzyme. DHT has about 10 times the affinity of testosterone to the androgenic receptors in the cells, so it is much more potent than testosterone. However, in adulthood, DHT levels are far too low to have any activity outside of the scalp, skin, and prostate, where it only does bad things like cause prostate enlargement, acne, and of course, androgenic alopecia. Furthermore, in people with the genetic propensity to androgenic alopecia, the scalp contains increased levels of DHT, and there are increased androgen receptors as well, hence why DHT is just so damn destructive to the hair follicles of people who have the androgenic alopecia gene. Now, it's still not 100% clear exactly how the activation of androgen receptors by DHT in the hair follicles inhibits hair growth, but some of the mechanisms have been worked out now. We know that activation of the androgen receptors increases TGF-beta1, which is a negative growth factor. Also, the androgen receptor activates what's called the DKK1, also known as the Dick-Cock protein, and this protein inhibits what is called the WNT WNT pathway, which is important for hair growth. There are several WNT factor stimulants that are being developed as hair loss remedies, and I have made videos discussing all of them, and I'll go ahead and link them below if you want to learn more about them. But anyways, we already know that we can inhibit the 5-AR enzyme and lower scalp DHT easily by using drugs like finasteride and dutasteride. Finasteride is, of course, the gold standard for the treatment of androgenic alopecia, and dutasteride is an even more potent 5-AR blocker. However, People sometimes are hesitant to use these drugs, and this is largely because of the lies and fear-mongering from groups like the Propecia Help and Ray Peat forums, which promote debunked fake conditions like post-finasteride syndrome, as well as dramatically exaggerate the risk of side effects. However, as dramatically overblown as the side effects of 5-AR inhibiting drugs are, like any drug, there is a small incidence of legitimate side effects as a consequence of using finasteride or dutasteride, such as reduced libido and erectile dysfunction. So, as great as finasteride is, there continues to be a lot of research and interest to find even better treatments for androgenetic alopecia that work better at both stopping hair loss as well as having an even lower risk of side effects. Also, it goes without saying that a breakthrough treatment for hair loss would be extremely profitable for whoever discovers it. So, besides targeting the 5-AR enzyme to stop hair loss, another possible and much more direct target is the androgen receptor itself. There are already a number of existing androgen receptor blockers out there, such as Fluridil, RU58841, and spironolactone, as well as a number of androgen receptor blockers under development, like piralutamide and clascoterone. A couple of problems, though, with androgen receptor blockers is that they have to be used locally, because blocking androgen receptors throughout the body would also block the effects of testosterone, which isn't something you want to do unless you are trying to transition. Another problem is that despite the logic behind using an androgen antagonist as a treatment for androgenic alopecia, they have never proven to be more effective than targeting hair loss through blocking the 5-AR pathway as you do when taking a drug like finasteride. So, the real challenge here for researchers, as well as hair loss switchers across the globe, has been how do we create an androgen receptor blocker that doesn't compromise virility, but is also strong enough to have at least comparable efficacy to 5-AR inhibiting drugs like finasteride and dutasteride? Well, maybe the answer isn't just to block the androgen receptor. Maybe we can just take a silver sword to the androgen receptors and get rid of the receptors altogether, at least on the scalp. Well, interestingly enough, this does seem to be possible. Yes, it is possible to annihilate the androgen receptors on the scalp, and even though research is still preliminary, this may very well be the most promising potential cure we have in development at the moment. There's actually another drug in development by Kintor Pharmaceuticals that also attempts to destroy the androgen receptors, and this one is called GT20029, and I'll link a video where I discuss that below. But this treatment, despite having a similar outcome to GT20029, has a completely different mechanism, and it could potentially be even more effective at stopping hair loss. So, to explain how this thing works, there is a technology that can be applied to this problem, and that technology is called RNA interference. It's pretty complicated, but it is a recently developed technique that can target and inhibit individual genes in our cells. The technique uses short fragments of RNA called SIRNA, which, depending on who you believe, stands for either small interfering RNA or short interfering RNA or silencing RNA. These RNA fragments interfere with the whole process of how DNA uses RNA to create proteins like the androgen receptors, but they can be used to target very specific proteins like the androgen receptors without affecting any other mechanisms in the cell. Actually, these short fragments of RNA are naturally occurring in our cells, and they help regulate the gene expression in different cells. This figure you see here shows one of the ways this type of RNA works. In our cells, there are double strands of RNA shown here as dsRNA, or short strands of RNA shown here as shRNA. These strands are split up by an enzyme appropriately named dicer, which creates the siRNA. Another enzyme called argonate binds to the RNA and combines with some other proteins to form what's called an RNA-induced silencing complex, or RISC. The whole thing then binds to the specific messenger RNA, also known as mRNA, that is used to create the target protein. In this case, the androgen receptor and the RISC complex slices the mRNA in half, rendering it completely useless. So with this technique, you create your own siRNA that matches whatever messenger RNA you are trying to silence, and you can just knock out any specific protein you want to. So you can look at these RNA strands as little little Witcher molecules pre-programmed to find and kill monsters, or in this case, find and slice up androgen receptor mRNA. So this siRNA might be used to prevent androgen receptor synthesis in the scalp altogether, but unfortunately, standard siRNA has pretty severe inflammatory side effects and can stimulate the immune system and cause an inappropriate immune reaction. So conventional siRNA cannot be used for treating hair loss the same way Witcher potions cannot be used by humans. What the investigators in this study did to get around this, though, was create a new way to package siRNA into nanoparticles. This type of siRNA is called self-assembled micelle inhibitory RNA, or SAMiRNA. SAMiRNA, we'll go ahead and call it. What they did is pretty technical, but involves adding a hydrophilic end and a hydrophobic end on the RNA. Hydrophilic means something that can mix with water, and hydrophobic means something that avoids mixing with water. Having these two ends makes the RNA spontaneously form spherical nanoparticles like you see in this image here. The size of the particles is about 100 nanometers in length, and the particles have neutral charge. This makes these particles ideal for entry into cells, and they can be easily massaged into the skin. Theoretically, because the siRNA is packaged inside the nanoparticle, it will not react with the immune system and so should not cause an inflammatory response. So the investigators developed 547 variations of this SAMiRNA and tested them on cell cultures to find which variations were best able to suppress the androgen receptor. Here you see the winners of this competition in this figure. The variants AR68 and AR109 were best at suppressing androgen receptor synthesis. This next figure shows that AR68 won the competition and was best at suppressing the androgen receptor, which is abbreviated AR in this figure. Moreover, higher doses of AR68 had better suppression of the androgen receptor. So the investigators tested AR68 for cell toxicity, and it caused no toxicity. They also found the nanoparticles remained stable for 6 months, and after 6 months, the particles were still effective. So lots of very interesting theory here, but the big question is, do these nanoparticles work in humans with hair loss? Well, to their credit, the investigators didn't stop there. They did 2 clinical trials that were controlled, double-blinded studies. The first trial enrolled 48 men and women with moderate androgenic alopecia. They used a low dose of AR68, 0.5 milligrams per milliliter, 3 times per week, and they compared it to a placebo. They followed the subjects with global photographs and phototrichograms. The study lasted for 24 weeks. Here are some representative photos. So it's hard to see much change here. There was a small increase in hair counts, though, from 133 to 135 hairs per square centimeter. Fortunately, there were no adverse effects. Patient self-assessment didn't show any real improvements either, though. So this first study was not too impressive, but keep in mind they used a pretty low dose of nanoparticles. Next, they decided to try a 5 milligram per milliliter dose once a week. The investigators hoped this would be more effective and also more convenient since you only needed to apply the nanoparticles once per week. This time, they enrolled 60 men and women with moderate androgenic alopecia. Unfortunately, 17 subjects ended up dropping out of the study for reasons that aren't clear, but we know it wasn't due to side effects. Fortunately, though, in this study, the results were better than in the low-dose study. Hair density was improved looking at the global photos at 8, 16, and 24 weeks. Phototrichograms showed the average hair counts increased from 182 to 190 hairs per square centimeter after 24 weeks, which was an increase of 8 hairs per square centimeter. This time, patient self-assessment reported improvements. There were no improvements in the hair in subjects on the placebo. So, as far as safety is concerned, one subject on treatment had some redness and itching of the scalp, but this was felt by their dermatologist to be completely unrelated to the treatment and resolved while continuing treatment. So overall, in this second study, the treatment looks very promising. So let's summarize what this study showed. These SAMiRNA nanoparticles inhibit androgen receptor synthesis, and they seem to be stable and don't seem to cause any toxicity. The dose of 5 milligrams per milliliter once a week did cause significant hair regrowth in a small randomized study. The investigators compared the hair count changes to previous published studies of Finasteride and concluded that the improvement was 83% of the improvement seen in other studies with Finasteride. However, they didn't directly compare the nanoparticles to Finasteride, so I think this is a bit of a stretch. So maybe it would be better to say that the results were roughly comparable to the results with Finasteride rather than trying to be so precise that they come up with this figure of 83%. So that brings us to the limitations of the study. First of all, the number of subjects were low. There were a number of dropouts from the high-dose study, even if they weren't related to the study drug. This weakens the results. Also, the authors themselves note that the study population wasn't very diverse. It was all good Koreans, and the investigators proposed doing larger studies that includes Caucasians and other racial groups. Finally, it looks like all the authors of the study work for various industries that would serve to profit from marketing these nanoparticles. This raises the question of bias and conflict of interest. I think the methodology of this research was really cutting edge, but clearly the results need to be replicated with a larger study group. But despite these limitations, I think this is pretty exciting work, and the theory is sound. Ultimately, if researchers are going to come up with a treatment that is better than Finasteride and that isn't a 5-AR inhibitor, then I think targeting the androgen receptor on the scalp, either by blocking these receptors pharmacologically, or like in this study, blocking the very synthesis of androgen receptors with RNA inhibition, may turn out to be better than a 5-AR blocker in lowering DHT in the treatment of androgenetic alopecia. Now, of course, I want to stress that the research on this treatment is preliminary and will require further randomized controlled trials with larger sample sizes to confirm the reliability of the outcome data, but I still wanted to bring attention to this data, not only because I think it holds promise, but also to remind my fellow hair loss witchers that there is real research being done by real researchers on hair loss. A lot of people in the hair loss community seem to have this idea that finasteride and minoxidil are all we're ever going to have, and thus we've seen communities of all these bro scientists springing up who are trying to crowdfund bogus broccoli treatments or revive obsolete theories about blood flow and scalp tension. Trust me, chums, hair loss is a huge industry, and there are many highly qualified doctors, chemists, and pharmacists using their collaborative talents to find true solutions towards the very real problem of hair loss. It will be their hard work and knowledge that brings us true innovation in fighting hair loss. It won't be because of bro scientists on Reddit and hair loss forums who have no background in research yet still are desperately trying to find whatever connections they can, and that is how we wind up with nonsense theories that still make visiting hair loss forums and subreddits absolutely fucking unbearable these days, like sulforaphane, castor oil, and skull expansion, amongst other nonsense. If you want to follow legitimate hair loss research, then it is important you stay off the forums and subreddits and instead turn to the scientific journals where actual scientific research on the subject of hair loss is being published and peer-reviewed, unlike in hair loss forums and subreddits where anyone can post whatever bullshit they want and not get challenged on it. I'm not trying to discover the hair loss cure or discover some new theory that explains everything, because I have the humility to realize I am not qualified to do so. What I can do, though, and what I will continue to do on this channel, is present a scientific point of view on important subjects regarding hair loss in order to help others better understand them, as well as bring attention to important ideas that sometimes get overshadowed by the oversaturation of absolute bullshit that sometimes causes legitimate research to get lost in translation. So, alright, I'm out. Until next time, my fellow hair loss witchers, thank you for watching. Take care.